Before we dive in, drop a quick hi in the comments. It may seem small, but trust me, it really helps YouTube share this story with more sci-fi fans like us. I'd love to see who's watching.
The first contact signature bloomed across the sensor wall of the TCS Argent, like a wound tearing open in space. One moment, nothing. The next, 1,400 points of light. Lieutenant Commander Harsk stood behind the tactical plot as red markers cascaded across the holographic display. They multiplied faster than the system could assign threat profiles. The ranking algorithm cycled twice, failed to prioritize, and defaulted to a single blinking classification it had never been designed to display at this scale. Overwhelming force. No tactical solution available. Harsk killed the classification with a tap before anyone else on the bridge crew could read it. "Confirm count," he said. The sensor officer's voice was flat, professional, but his hands had stopped moving. 1,400, all cruiser mass or above. Formation is distributed across a 600-kilometer front, bearing directly for the colony orbital. Harsk looked at the plot again. The red markers filled it edge to edge. The human fleet, 42 blue capital markers, and a scattered constellation of 180 escort pips, looked like a handful of gravel thrown against a red wall. The TCS Argent was Fleet Admiral Cosen's flagship, a Resolute-class dreadnought, the largest thing humanity had ever put into vacuum, 1,100 meters of layered titanium steel composite and reactor mass. Against the thing on the sensor wall, it was a pebble. Harsk picked up the internal comms handset and pressed the flag channel. Flag bridge, CIC, sensor confirmation, 1,400 hostile contacts, cruiser class, closing at 0.15 C. Time to weapons range, 11 minutes. A pause. Then Cosen's voice, calm, understood. The channel closed. Harsk set the handset down. 11 minutes. He looked at the plot one more time and did the math that every officer on the bridge was already doing silently. 1,400 to 42, 33 to 1. The broadcast came in on every frequency simultaneously. It overrode the fleet's encrypted tactical channels. It punched through the civilian bands used by the Tau Ceti 4 orbital stations. It bled into the emergency frequencies reserved for search and rescue. Every speaker on every ship in the system carried the same voice. It was translated by machine. The Korath did not speak human languages. But the syntax was deliberate. Clipped. The cadence of something that had rehearsed this moment. Human force. You are within range of the Korath hegemony's resonant fleet. Your hull composites have been analyzed. Your molecular resonance frequency has been mapped. Our weapons are calibrated to your exact structural tolerance. A pause. Not for drama. For data transmission. The Korath were simultaneously broadcasting the technical readout, proving their claim. Spectral analysis of human titanium steel composite. Resonance frequency, 7.83 terahertz. Pulse calibration, locked. They were showing their work. You will surrender all vessels, deactivate all reactors, and evacuate crews to unpowered lifeboats for collection. Non-compliance will result in total structural dissolution of your fleet. Your colony will be administered under hegemony authority. The voice did not say, or else. It did not need to. You have 4 minutes to respond. Surrender or disintegrate. The broadcast ended. On the Argent's bridge, no one spoke. The sensor officer stared at his console. The weapons team sat motionless. The helmsman's grip on his control yoke had gone white. Harsk opened the fleet-wide command channel, not to broadcast, to listen. What he heard was worse than panic. He heard the escorts. The destroyer Viking, running at the fleet's forward picket. CIC, we are reading the resonance data. They have our frequency. Confirm. Do we have countermeasures? Viking actual requests guidance. The frigate Boyne, port flank. Flag, Boyne. Our hull is standard composite. 1 pulse and we fold. Request permission to withdraw escorts to Colony Shadow. The corvette Strake, trailing formation. Any station, Strake. We are not equipped for this. Repeat, we are not equipped. Harsk listened to 14 more transmissions. Each escort in the fleet was reporting the same thing. They were right. The escorts carried no counterpulse projectors. Their hulls were standard titanium steel composite, the exact material the Korath weapons were designed to shatter. One pulse at the tuned frequency, and the molecular bonds in their hull plating would resonate to failure. The ship would tear itself apart from the skin inward. The escorts knew this. They also knew no one was answering them. Fleet Admiral Kosand stood on the flag bridge of the Argent and watched the countdown timer on the main display. 3 minutes, 40 seconds to the end of the Korath ultimatum. The flag bridge was smaller than the CIC below, a raised platform with direct sight lines to the tactical plot, the communications station, and the fleet synchronization console. 6 officers. No wasted space. Kosand was 61. He had commanded the Tau Ceti defense group for 4 years. He had never fired a weapon in anger. No human fleet commander had. Not out here. The colony had been at peace since its founding. He had, however, spent those 4 years running a program that no one in the escort fleet knew about. Synchronization status, he said. The officer at the fleet sync console, a specialist transferred from the Astrophysics Warfare Division, a unit that did not officially exist, responded without looking up. All 42 capital ships reporting phase lock readiness. Counterpulse projectors are charged. Synchronization tolerance is at 0.002 seconds. Within margin. Power reserves. Full charge across all dreadnoughts and battlecruisers. Broadcast endurance at maximum output. 9 minutes, 14 seconds, fleet average. The Argent can sustain 9 minutes 40. Kosand nodded. 9 minutes. That was the window. After that, the reactors would begin emergency shutdown to prevent core breach, and the counterpulse would die. If the Korath stopped firing before the cascade went self-sustaining, the interference web would collapse. The nodes would dissolve. And 1,400 cruisers with resonance cannons would be facing a human fleet with dead reactors and no defense. Everything depended on one assumption, that the Korath would not stop shooting. Kosand had read every piece of intelligence ever gathered on Korath military doctrine, all intercepted communication, every after-action report from the 3 previous species the hegemony had conquered. The Korath never stopped shooting. It was not arrogance. It was doctrine. Resonant wave warfare rewarded sustained fire. Each successive pulse reinforced the resonance cascade in the target hull, accelerating structural failure. Korath tactical manuals mandated continuous volley fire until the target was confirmed destroyed. They would keep shooting because their own tactics told them to. Kosand looked at the escort channels. He could see the requests stacking up. 14 destroyers, 31 frigates, and a dozen corvettes asking for orders, asking for countermeasures, asking to withdraw. He could not tell them. If he broadcast the counterpulse plan on any channel the Korath might intercept, the entire strategy collapsed. The Korath would simply stop firing, hold at range, and pick the fleet apart with massed volleys timed to avoid phase lock. The escorts had to stay in formation. They had to look like part of the defense, and they could not know why. Kosand opened the capital ship command channel, encrypted, narrowband, routed through the Argent's dedicated laser comm array. Korath signals intelligence could not intercept it. All capital ships, begin counterpulse sequence on my mark. Maintain broadcast until I order cut or until reactor limits are reached. Do not deviate from assigned phase. Do not respond to escort requests. Do not break formation. He paused. Mark. 42 ships answered with a single synchronized tone across the lasercom net. Ready. Kosand looked at the countdown timer. 40 seconds to the end of the ultimatum. He did not respond to the Korath. The ultimatum expired in silence. The Korath fleet fired. 1,400 cruisers discharged their gravitic emitters simultaneously. The volley was not staggered. It was not phased. Every ship fired at once, a wall of resonant energy tuned to 7.83 terahertz, crossing the void at light speed. On the Argent sensor wall, the pulse front appeared as a single flat plane of distortion, racing toward the human fleet. Space itself bent along the wave's leading edge. Stars behind it shivered and split into brief prismatic arcs before snapping back. The wave front was 600 kilometers wide. It covered the entire human formation. There was no dodging it, no maneuvering around it, no shielding against it. It reached the human fleet in 1.3 seconds. On the bridge of the destroyer Viking, running at the forward picket, the officer of the watch saw the distortion wave crossing the last 1,000 kilometers toward his ship and understood with perfect clarity that he was about to die. He gripped the edge of his console. The wave passed over the Viking without effect. It passed over the Boyne, the Strake, every escort in the formation. It hit the capital ships, and the capital ships answered. 42 dreadnoughts and battlecruisers activated their counterpulse projectors in the same instant, broadcasting a gravitic wave on the exact opposite phase of the incoming Korath pulse. The timing was not approximate. The synchronization officer on the Argent had locked the fleet's output to within 0.02 of a second. The phase inversion was mathematically perfect. The two waves met in the space between the fleets. They did not cancel cleanly. The collision of two precisely opposed gravitic pulses across a 600-kilometer front did not produce silence. It produced something worse. Standing nodes. Spherical zones of gravitic compression, each one a point where the overlapping waves reinforced into crushing force. They formed in a lattice pattern, hundreds of them, suspended in the void like invisible mines, each one exerting 200 gravities of inward pressure on anything inside its radius. The nodes were between the fleets, and the Korath were still firing. Their second volley crossed the node field 3 seconds after the first. The pulses hit the standing nodes and amplified them. The nodes grew denser, stronger. The lattice tightened. On the flag bridge of the Argent, the synchronization officer reported in a voice that had lost all professional detachment. Node formation confirmed. Count, 312 and rising. The field is expanding toward the Korath formation. Admiral, it's working. Cossand did not respond to that. He was watching the plot. The red markers at the leading edge of the Korath formation were now inside the node field. The closest cruisers, the ones at the tip of the 600-kilometer front, were less than 40 kilometers from the nearest standing nodes. And they were firing their third volley. Each pulse they sent into the field made the nodes stronger. Each node they strengthened pulled closer to their hulls. Cossand watched the first red marker on the plot begin to flicker. Then it went out. The first Korath cruiser to die had no name that human systems could translate. It was designated Contact 7 on the Argent's tactical plot, a bone-white hull with red scoring that pulsed bright along its weapon spine as it fired its fourth volley into the void. The volley never reached the human fleet. The gravitic pulse crossed 19 kilometers before it intersected a standing node at the outer edge of the lattice. The node absorbed the pulse energy, swelled to nearly double its radius, and then Contact 7's forward hull entered the compression sphere. The effect was not dramatic from a distance. The ship did not explode. There was no fireball, no oxygen and vacuum to burn. The forward third of Contact 7 simply shortened. Over 1,000 meters of bone-white hull compressed to less than half its length in under a second. The bow crumpled inward like a fist closing around wet paper. Structural ribs that had been engineered to withstand standard acceleration loads folded like foil under gravitational pressure they were never designed to meet. Atmosphere vented from the rupture points in white jets that froze instantly into expanding clouds of ice crystal. The ship's gravitic emitter, still cycling for another pulse, discharged once into its own collapsing hull, and added its energy to the node that was eating it. The aft section, engines, reactor, the surviving crew compartments, tumbled backward out of the node's radius, spinning, venting, dark. It lasted 4 seconds before a second node caught it. What remained was a compressed sphere of alloy, calcium composite, and biological matter, roughly 9 meters in diameter, drifting with a faint rotation imparted by the last firing thrust of engines that no longer existed. On the Argent's tactical plot, Contact 7's red marker vanished. Contact 12 followed within seconds. Then Contact 19. Then an entire cluster of markers at the leading edge of the formation winked out in a cascade so fast the plot's refresh rate could not keep pace. Red markers did not fade. They simply ceased to exist between one frame and the next, leaving dark gaps in the wall of enemy contacts, like teeth knocked from a jaw. Lieutenant Commander Harsk stood in the CIC and watched the plot update. The node field, displayed as a mesh of pale blue spheres overlaid on the tactical grid, was expanding toward the Korath formation at a rate that the tracking algorithm had already revised upward twice. The lattice was not static. Each new Korath volley that crossed the field generated additional nodes, and each new node shifted the geometry of the lattice, pulling existing nodes into tighter configurations. The field was learning. Not intelligently, there was no mind behind it. But the physics of overlapping gravitic waveforms created a pattern that responded to energy input by growing denser, tighter, and more lethal with every passing second. "Node count," Harsk said. The sensor officer shook his head slowly, not in refusal, but in something closer to disbelief. "Climbing fast, faster than the model predicted. We're gaining new nodes with every volley cycle, and the rate is compounding." Harsk studied the lattice overlay on the plot. The blue mesh was thickening visibly, the gaps between nodes shrinking as new ones spawned in the spaces where pulses intersected. At this rate, the field would become a wall, an impenetrable lattice of gravitational kill zones stretching across the entire front. He looked at the Korath formation on the plot. The leading edge of their 600-kilometer front had pushed into the outer boundary of the node field. The cruisers at the tips of the formation, the ones closest to the expanding lattice, were dying fastest. Their markers disappeared in clusters, blinking out in rapid succession as the field swallowed them ship by ship. But the cruisers behind them were still firing through the gaps, and their pulses were feeding the field from depth. They were shooting through a minefield that grew a new mine every time they pulled the trigger. "Korath rate of fire?" Harsk asked. "Unchanged, sustained volley pattern, no deviation from initial cycle timing." They had not adapted. Their forward echelon was being consumed, and they had not changed a single parameter of their attack. Harsk understood why. He had read the same intelligence briefs that Kosand had. The Korath did not adapt under fire. Their doctrine was built on the assumption that sustained resonance bombardment would destroy any target, and it always had. Against the 3 species they had previously conquered, it worked. Volley after volley, until the target shook itself apart. They had never encountered a target that turned their volleys into a weapon. Their tactical manuals had no page for this. On the flag bridge, Kosand watched the plot with the same flat expression he had worn since the first shot was fired. The counterpulse was holding. All 42 capital ships maintained phase lock, broadcasting their inverted waveform in perfect synchronization. The synchronization officer called out the timing drift every 30 seconds. It had not exceeded the design tolerance since activation. The node field was performing beyond anyone's projections. "Korath attrition is accelerating," the tactical officer reported. His voice was carefully neutral, but his eyes kept returning to the plot as another cluster of red markers vanished from the enemy's forward line. "At current kill rate, we are looking at significant fleet degradation within minutes." Minutes. Cosson did not look at the tactical officer. He looked at the reactor status board on the auxiliary display. The numbers there told a different story. The capital ships were burning through their power reserves at the rate the engineers had warned him about during the classified briefings 2 years ago. The counterpulse projectors were enormous energy sinks, each one drawing more power per second than a dreadnought's main engines at full thrust. The reactors could sustain it, but not forever, and not for much longer. The margin was thin. If the cascade did not become self-sustaining before the reactors hit their limits, the counterpulse would die, the node field would dissipate, and the surviving Korath fleet, still vast, still armed, would be facing human ships with drained reactors and no defense. Only minutes to break them. Fewer minutes of fuel to do it with. Cosson accepted the math and said nothing. As the node field expanded, the escorts began to die. Not from Korath fire. The resonance pulses had stopped reaching the human formation entirely. Every volley was being absorbed by the node field before it crossed the midpoint between the fleets. The Korath weapons could no longer touch the human line. But the node field did not care whose hull it crushed. The lattice was expanding in every direction, forward into the Korath formation, where it was grinding through their cruisers with mechanical indifference. Laterally, along the 600-kilometer front, filling the spaces where the wave geometry overlapped, and backward, toward the human fleet's flanks, where the escorts held their screening positions. The physics did not distinguish between bone-white Korath calcium composite and human titanium steel. A hull was a hull. Mass was mass. The nodes compressed whatever entered their radius with the same blind, crushing force. The first escort to die was the frigate Boyne. She was holding station on the port flank, well clear of the capital ship formation, when a cluster of nodes formed in a space that had been empty seconds earlier. The nodes materialized along a line that intersected Boyne's midship section, a consequence of the latest Korath volley refracting through the field's outer boundary at an angle no one had predicted and no model had accounted for. Boyne's captain had a handful of seconds to react. His sensor officer saw the gravimetric spike and called it out. The helmsman threw the ship into an emergency turn to port, engines flaring white as the drives pushed beyond rated output. The turn saved the bow. It did not save the rest. The node cluster caught Boyne from amidships aft. The compression effect folded the frigate's stern inward like a closing hinge. The reactor compartment, the engine room, the aft crew quarters, everything behind the midship bulkhead was crushed into a mass no larger than a standard cargo container. Structural framing designed to hold the ship rigid under acceleration loads simply ceased to exist as a recognizable shape. Atmosphere howled out of the ruptured midsection in a torrent that froze into a spreading cloud of white crystal. The bow section, still intact, still powered by emergency batteries, still showing life signs on the Argent's medical telemetry, tumbled away in a slow spin, trailing frozen vapor and sparking electrical conduit. On the Argent's medical monitoring station, the life signs from Boyne's bow section appeared as a cluster of fading traces, heartbeats slowing, thermal signatures dropping as the batteries failed, and the heating system died with them. Each trace winked out individually, not all at once, not mercifully fast, but one by one, over the span of nearly 2 minutes, as the surviving crew in the bow section died of decompression and cold in a fragment of a ship that was no longer a ship. The last trace held longer than the others. Someone in the forward damage control station sealed behind an emergency bulkhead that held pressure for an extra 40 seconds. The trace flickered, steadied, flickered again. Then it was gone. Cosson received the report. He did not order a rescue. There was nothing to send. Every capital ship was locked into broadcast formation. Any ship that broke phase lock would open a gap in the counterpulse, and a gap would let Korath resonance pulses through to the rest of the fleet. The escorts had no tractor beams, no retrieval capability that could function inside an active gravitic distortion field. Boyne's crew was dead. The field kept expanding. The destroyer Halleck, holding the starboard flank, reported gravimetric distortion close enough to its hull that the outer plating had begun to vibrate. The vibration was low, almost subsonic, transmitted through the hull as a deep thrumming that the crew felt in their teeth and their sternums before the sensors registered it on their instruments. Halleck's captain reported the contact and requested guidance. The corvette Strake, trailing the formation, reported worse. Nodes forming directly in her projected flight path, not one, a cluster, spawning in sequence as a refracted pulse bounced through the field's ragged trailing edge. The gap Strake occupied was closing like a fist. Strake's captain did not wait for guidance. He requested emergency course deviation, his voice tight with the controlled urgency of a man who could feel the walls closing in and understood exactly what the walls were made of. Cosand opened the escort command channel for the first time since the battle began. His voice carried no urgency, no sympathy, no acknowledgement that ships had already died under his command. The tone was the same flat, unhurried cadence he had used to say "understood" when Harsk first reported the enemy fleet's arrival. All escorts, execute emergency displacement, clear the flank zones, move to the shadow of the capital ship formation, maintain minimum safe distance from any capital ship to avoid reactor interference. He paused. Do it now. The escorts broke formation and ran, not outward. The node field was expanding laterally, and there was nowhere to go on the flanks. They drove inward, toward the center of the human line, crowding into the protected space behind the wall of dreadnoughts and battlecruisers that were generating the counterpulse. Engines flared across the formation as destroyers, frigates, and corvettes abandoned their screening positions and sprinted for the narrow corridor of safe space that still existed between the capital ships and the growing lattice at their backs. Most of them made it. The corvette Strake did not. She was already too deep in the field's trailing edge. The cluster of nodes in her flight path had merged into a single compression zone as a fresh Korath volley sent a pulse refracting through the lattice boundary at an oblique angle. The gap that Strake had been trying to thread closed in the time it took her helmsman to push the throttle to emergency power. Strake flew directly into it at full thrust. The compression effect took her bow first. The ship did not fold or crumple. At her closing speed, there was no time for deformation. Strake hit the node the way a bird hits a window. Instantaneous, total. The bow compacted into the midsection. The midsection compacted into the engine block. The engine block compacted into a disc of fused metal and composite that was still traveling at Strake's last velocity when it exited the far side of the node. A flat spinning plate of wreckage, no thicker than a man's arm span, and no wider than the bridge it had once contained. Everything that the crew of the Strake had been, their training, their fear, their names, their bodies, was compressed into that disc. The alloy did not distinguish between steel and bone. At that pressure, there was no difference. The disc tumbled away into the void, cooling, slowing, becoming just another piece of debris in a battle that was manufacturing debris at industrial scale. On the Argent's flag bridge, the escort status board updated. Strake's marker changed from amber to black. The synchronization officer was watching the reactor board now more than the tactical plot. The numbers that mattered were no longer on the enemy side of the field. They were on his own. Reactor thermal warnings across multiple capital ships, Admiral. The Vanguard and the Torchbearer are running hotter than the rest. They will hit emergency shutdown thresholds before the fleet average. Cosand heard him. He was watching the Korath formation on the plot. The attrition was obvious now. The leading edge of the Korath front had been chewed ragged. Whole sections of the formation simply gone, replaced by empty space and drifting compression spheres that the plot did not bother to track. The cruisers that had been at the tip of the assault were dead. The ones behind them were dying. The lattice was grinding through their ranks with the patience of a machine that did not know what mercy was and could not have been taught. But the Korath fleet was vast. The formation stretched deep. Behind the dying forward echelon, behind the burning middle ranks, the rear echelon still held formation. Cruisers that had not yet seen their wingmates die at close range. Ships whose commanders were still following doctrine because doctrine was all they had, and nothing in their experience suggested it could fail. Their volley timing had become irregular, not a coordinated rate reduction. Individual ships were hesitating. A half-second delay here, a full second there. The rear echelon was still firing at full cycle rate. The middle echelon was not. Captains watching the cruisers ahead of them fold inward like crumpled parchment, and feeling, for the first time in the Korath hegemony's military history, something their doctrine had no protocol for. Doubt. Doubt was spreading through the middle ranks the way the node field was spreading through their fleet, silently, invisibly, one ship at a time. A captain who hesitated before his next volley, a weapons officer whose finger hovered over the firing command for a beat too long, a bridge crew that watched the forward plot and saw nothing but collapsing markers and wondered in the private silence of their own minds whether the next volley they fired would be the one that spawned the node that killed them. If enough of them stopped firing, the node field would thin. The lattice would develop gaps. The surviving cruisers could pull back through those gaps and regroup at range. Cossand saw it. He could see the rate of fire analysis on the tactical display, a graph that tracked aggregate Korath volley output over time. The line had been flat since the battle began. Now it was beginning to curve downward. Not steeply, not yet. But the trend was there, visible to anyone who knew what to look for. Cossand looked at the reactor board. The power reserves were draining visibly now, the status bars shortening in real time as the counterpulse projectors consumed energy faster than the reactors could generate it. The Vanguard and Torchbearer were in the amber zone. Several others were approaching it. He looked at the node field on the plot. Dense, growing, lethal, but still dependent on two energy inputs. The human counterpulse feeding it from one side, the Korath volleys feeding it from the other. Remove either input and the field would begin to decay. The standing waves would lose coherence. The lattice would thin, develop holes, and collapse. The humans could not stop broadcasting, not yet. The Korath were beginning to stop firing. And between those two facts, the entire battle balanced on a point no wider than a razor's edge. The synchronization officer spoke again. His voice was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes from understanding exactly how bad the situation is and choosing to report it without editorializing. Admiral, if the Korath reduce their aggregate volley rate by roughly half, the node field will begin to decay faster than we can sustain it. We will lose lattice integrity before the cascade reaches critical threshold. Cossand stared at the plot. Everything depended on the next 60 seconds. If the Korath kept firing, if doctrine held, if the rear echelon's blind obedience outweighed the middle echelon's growing terror, the cascade would reach critical density and become self-sustaining. The node field would no longer need the human counterpulse or the Korath volleys to maintain itself. It would feed on its own energy, on the death pulses of collapsing ships, on the gravitic echoes of every cruiser it crushed. The humans could cut their broadcast, save their reactors, and let physics finish what they had started. But if the Korath stopped, if doubt won, the field would collapse. And the capital ships, reactors drained, projectors dark, would face the surviving Korath fleet with nothing between them and annihilation, but empty space. Cossand could not make the Korath fire. He could not taunt them into it. He could not bait them, provoke them or trick them. There was no transmission he could send, no maneuver he could execute, no bluff he could run that would override the survival instinct of 1,000 alien captains watching their fleet die around them. He could only wait and watch. The flag bridge was silent. The synchronization officer watched the reactor board. The tactical officer watched the plot. The communications officer sat with his hands in his lap because there was no one to call and nothing to say. Cossand stood with his hands clasped behind his back, feet planted on the deck of a ship that was burning through its last reserves of poor to sustain a defensive system that would save everyone or no one, and he watched the Korath rate of fire graph on the tactical display and did not breathe. The line kept curving downward. The Korath captain, who understood first, was not the highest-ranking officer in the fleet. He was not in the rear echelon where the commanders still barked volley orders with the confidence of beings who had never lost a war. He was in the middle, wedged between the dying forward line and the obedient rear, close enough to see the compression spheres forming ahead of his bow, close enough to watch the bone-white hull of his portside wingman fold inward like something soft being squeezed in a giant's fist. He ordered his weapons officer to cease fire. Nothing in Korath military protocol allowed for a unilateral cessation of volley fire during an active engagement. The concept did not exist in their tactical language. Their word for retreat translated more accurately as repositioning for continued bombardment. Their word for defeat did not exist at all. But this captain had watched the ship ahead of him fire a volley and die 3 seconds later, the pulse it launched refracting through the lattice and spawning a node that collapsed back onto its own hull. He had watched the ship to his starboard fire and die, the ship below him, the ship above. Every ship that fired died faster than the ships that hesitated. The equation was not complicated. He ordered ceasefire. His weapons officer complied. His gravitic emitters went dark. His ship drifted forward under residual momentum, bone-white hull reflecting the pale blue-shifted light of nodes forming and dissolving in the lattice ahead. It did not matter. His ship was already inside the lattice, surrounded by compression zones that shifted as the rear echelon's volleys fed the web. The nodes were not fixed points. They reorganized with every new input of energy. A rear echelon volley refracted through the lattice and spawned a compression zone directly beneath the silent captain's keel. He had stopped singing. The echo did not care. The node took his ship from below. The ventral hull buckled first, then the internal decks pancaked upward, deck after deck, compressing into the one above it. The bridge was the last compartment to go. The captain had time to see his deck plating rising toward him before the ceiling came down to meet it. The ship that had stopped firing died exactly as fast as the ships that had not did one. On the Argent's flag bridge, the synchronization officer's voice cut through the silence. "Admiral, Cascade threshold." Cossand did not move. His eyes stayed on the tactical plot. "Confirm," he said. "The node field is self-sustaining. Distortion pulse echoes from destroyed Korath vessels are generating sufficient energy to maintain and expand the lattice independent of our broadcast. The cascade is critical. Self-sustaining." The node field no longer needed the human counterpulse. It was feeding on death now, each imploding cruiser releasing a final burst of uncontrolled gravitic energy that spawned new nodes, which crushed more ships and spawned more in turn. A chain reaction. Not nuclear. Gravitational. Cossand looked at the reactor board. The Vanguard was deep in the red. The torchbearer was seconds from automatic shutdown. Across the fleet, every capital ship was approaching reactor tolerance. "All capital ships," Cossand said. "Cut broadcast." The counterpulse died across the fleet in staggered sequence. Some projectors went dark before the order arrived as safeties tripped. Dreadnoughts and battlecruisers fell silent one by one, reactors dropping to emergency idle. The node field did not flicker. It did not thin. It grew. For several minutes after the broadcast fell silent, the cascade fed on the energy already released. The field no longer needed input. It was finishing what had already begun. The Korath rear echelon realized what was happening in stages. First, confusion. Their volleys still crossed the void, but the lattice was no longer between the fleets. It had consumed the forward and middle ranks and was expanding backward through the space they had occupied. They were firing into a wall of annihilation that was walking toward them. Then recognition. The lattice was not a barrier. It was a sphere, expanding in every direction. Then panic, and the rear echelon broke formation. Ships peeled away laterally. Some reversed thrust, engines flaring as they tried to outrun the expanding radius. Some fired directly into the lattice in desperate volleys. Those ships died first. Their pulses fed the lattice, and it surged into the space they occupied. Nodes bloomed around their hulls, silent and lethal. Bone-white superstructures crumpled. The ships that ran fared no better. The lattice expansion was exponential. Each death expanded the field's reach. Ships running at full thrust were overtaken, caught from behind, compressed mid-flight, their wreckage spheres continuing forward along their original vectors. On the Argent's CIC, Harsk watched the plot. The red markers were disappearing faster than the display could animate. Whole sections of the formation simply ceased to exist between refresh cycles. The node overlay had become nearly solid, a storm front of gravitational distortion rolling through the former battle space. The sensor officer stopped reporting node counts. The numbers were meaningless. Harsk watched the last cluster of red markers at the far edge of the display. The node field slowly began to dissipate, its standing waves losing coherence without fresh energy input. The markers vanished, one after another. Then there were none. The classified projections had been clear. Not all escorts would reach the shadow of the capital ships. Kosant had known that before he gave the displacement order. The destroyer Halleck made it. She cleared the trailing edge with enough margin that her crew felt only a deep shudder through the deck. The TCS Viking had been too far forward. She had run, her helmsman threaded between forming nodes with precision that would have been remarkable under any other circumstances. She had almost made it. A node formed less than a kilometer ahead. She cleared it by meters. A second formed behind her. She cleared it by fractions of a second. The third formed inside her. Barely 4 meters across, it materialized between her forward reactor and crew compartment and crushed a cylinder of hull and decking, severing the Viking in two. The bow tumbled forward. The stern spun out of control. Power failed within seconds. Neither section was recovered. Other escorts died in the same minutes. Too far out, too slow, too unlucky in the shifting geometry of the field. They were markers changing from amber to black. Life sign clusters fading on the telemetry board. The node field dissipated over the next several minutes, bleeding energy into vacuum as the standing waves lost coherence. The wreckage remained. A vast grid of compressed spheres filled the void. Korath cruisers reduced to fused alloy and calcium composite. From a distance, they looked like gray pearls suspended in black water. Among them were the smaller spheres, the escorts, titanium steel instead of calcium composite, human instead of Korath, reduced to the same geometry. The last transmission from the Korath fleet came during the Cascade's final expansion. A single signal on an open channel. The translation was fragmentary. "The wave, it's coming back." Then static. The communications officer played it once. Kosant listened and returned his attention to the plot as the last distortions faded. The battle was over. The Korath strike force was gone. The cost was written in black across the board. Kosant looked at the escort status board and counted the markers in silence. He would write the letters himself. But not now. "Admiral, channel is clear. Open it. Broad spectrum." The transmission would propagate outward at light speed, beyond the system, into whatever remained of the Korath hegemony. Kosand spoke. You sang the song. We sang it louder. The channel closed. Outside, gray spheres drifted beneath an alien star, the place where the Korath hegemony learned that some songs have echoes.
Hey there, space human. I'm really curious about your thoughts on this video. Drop a quick comment and let me know what's on your mind. Or just say hi if you prefer. Either way, I'd love to hear from you. Also, remember to check the pinned comment. Trust me, it's worth a look. Oh, and one last thing. I've chosen another video for you to watch. Just click the card here. Or here if you want the whole playlist. See you there.